Hi.
Oh, yeah.
Very warm welcome to everyone. I'd like to thank you all for coming this morning. Just to let you know, my name is Toya Cinque. Together with Luke Heemsbergen, we lead the Critical Digital Infrastructures and Interfaces group. And we are dedicated to analysing and improving and advocating for digital infrastructures. And what we look to here is promoting the development and maintenance of technologies that support digital communication and information exchange, ensuring that they are accessible, resilient, secure, sustainable, innovative, and ethical. We look to addressing issues around the digital divide, enhancing cybersecurity, promoting environmentally friendly practices, supporting technological advances, ensuring privacy and inclusivity in digital spaces. And this is through the exciting events such as today, as well as creative initiatives through Melbourne Design Week and Creative Exhibition. We're so delighted to have Payal Arora with us today. Before we begin, I'd like to invite Lauren Bevilacqua, who's going to give our welcome to country. This is a tradition that we have in Australia to acknowledge the Indigenous peoples of the lands. And then Lauren will introduce Luke Heemsbergen. Thanks, Lauren.
Good morning, everybody. My name's Lauren Bevilacqua. I'm one of the researchers in the CDII research group. It's my pleasure today to give our acknowledgement of country. The lands on which Deakin University campuses are located were never ceded and were and are places of age-old ceremonies of celebration, initiation and renewal, where the local Aboriginal peoples have had and continue to have a unique role in the life of these lands. We acknowledge the traditional custodians of all the unceded lands, skies and waterways on which we come together today. As we gather through virtually and physically constructed places across time, we offer our deep respect to the ancestors and elders of Wadawurrung country, Eastern Maar country and Wurundjeri country, as well as the traditional custodians of all the lands on which you may be joining us from remotely, where learning has taken place for many thousands of years. Thank you. Luke.
Well, it is my pleasure to introduce Payal to everyone here. And just before I do, you can see we'll probably have a talk for around 45 minutes, if that's how long you take. I think we talked a little bit about this, but we'll aim for that. And then we'll have 20 minutes for Q&A. And we will have Q&A from our live YouTube stream that we will acknowledge. So if you are watching on YouTube, although it seems like a minute delay, you will have your questions hopefully answered. Lauren and I will pass them to Payal as appropriate. So with that, I'm honored to introduce Payal to Australia. I think on our second and a half day here. It always feels like, you know, the fifth by the time you get here. But I'm a little bit sad because she had the best bio up on our website that was so cheeky and perfect. And I wanted to read it word for word. And I went to get it again. And of course, it was not there. It had been replaced by a more proper bio. So I'm quite sad about that. I didn't look through my history to say that. But Payal is a professor of inclusive AI cultures at Utrecht. And co-founder of FemLab, which is a feminist futures of work initiative that she's worked on for some time. She's a digital anthropologist and an author, speaker, and consultant. Her expertise draws from 2 decades of user experience among low-income communities worldwide to shape different types of inclusive design practices and policies. She's the author of a number of award-winning books, including but not limited to Leisure Commons, The Next Billion Users, that one with Harvard Press, And she has been prolific in the media as well as consulting on tech innovation for diverse organizations such as IDEO, Adobe, Spotify, Google, UNESCO, KPMG, GE, the UNHCR, and HP. We are very privileged to have her today, as she has given over 350 talks in 67 countries. And of the 115 cities, I believe that entails, I really hope you find Melbourne to be one of the best. She does have an upcoming book titled From Pessimism to Promise, Lessons from the Global South on Designing Inclusive Tech. And I think that's where I will gladly cede the floor to Payal so we can hear more. Thank you.
So thank you, Luke. And Luke, next time you just sort of scroll down a bit and then you'll see the not so formal bio, which by the way, it's because I used to be in the art world. So I was an art dealer in San Francisco for many years. And for some long story over drinks, how I changed careers completely. But that's where I write my nitty gritty stuff. But all right, let's get started. I assume I should stay put here for the live streaming, so I won't move. I tend to move a lot, so I will restrain myself. Okay, so you know, the book springs from a lot of this anxiety that has come about in the last few years around new tech. Particularly, you see this in the headlines with a lot of concern about is AI, taking away our jobs, or is AI destroying democracy, or ruining our mental health? And you look at the kind of headlines here, it goes even further about creating war, terror, and even human extinction, right? And academia has done its bit to consolidate this sort of narrative of, really the oppressive, controlling nature of technology and how you need to resist it if you were to survive, right? So it is really, if you think about it, the positioning is AI versus humanity. AI is all about, oppressing us, controlling us. And, we as a society are trying our best to use every trick in the book and push against the big forces of big tech, but we are on the losing end. It feels very much like a David Goliath situation. And, I have to underline many of my experiences and engagements with students, with different people across different countries. Every time I've gone to give a talk from my previous works in the last few years, I've been listening to the sentiment of like helplessness, this feeling of like, what's the point? Or students feeling like, how am I supposed to proceed? You feel very undermotivated, right? And so this is really the motivation behind this book. And what I'd like to underline is that while these concerns, many of which are legitimate, they are vastly disproportionate to the actual full-fledged experiences, concerns, aspirations of people when they are using digital technologies. And when you don't account for the full picture, you're basically creating a sort of a narrative that can create a real pathology of impotence, right? So what I call as pessimism bias or pessimism paralysis is where it's not just despair, but absolute impotence towards all things digital, which propels you to ask different kinds of questions of how do I control this? How do I break things? And basically seeing things in oppositional ways and not in ways which can be in alignment with your well-being. So that means the kind of research you do, the kinds of policies you make can be extremely destructive for social progress. Now, obviously, I'm going to give you a different kind of narrative, which contrasts and which already starts with, articles that are coming up such as this. Are American progressives making themselves sad, right? So just recently, The Economist came up with this headline, which basically documented that many Americans reported being really depressed, far more than compared to the last few years. in their Gallup polls. And this stands interestingly in massive contrast to how the rest of the world feel. More than 9 in 10 young people in Kenya, Mexico, China, Nigeria, and India are optimistic about their futures. Okay? So clearly, this pessimism paralysis is not universally shared. Also, when it comes to productivity, many countries in the global south see AI as potentially a critical tool to be productive versus countries in Europe and the US, which rank very low in these charts, right? It's interesting. I was in Delhi recently, and my cousin is in this sort of multimedia small little startup. And I asked her, what does she think about generative media? And is she threatened? She's like, oh my God, yes, it's really scary, but super exciting because we get a lot of contract work from Australia. But, you know, it took us hours, sometimes days to hunt for the right accent because we have to train and get these people who are trained in, outsource centers to get the right accent for content. And now we just use generative AI and we can use, and within seconds, we have all the accents. Not only that, we can actually get the script going so we can really focus on the content. So we can pivot it, we can optimize the money. So it was just really practical stuff. And there's just one snippet of the numerous stories coming out of why there's a certain excitement about productivity, right? Even with climate change, by the way, where you must understand that global south is at the forefront of the climate crisis, where they're going to be the most impacted because they're the most vulnerable, and even then they are the most optimistic about this, right? About AI. So what is going on? I mean, is it potentially because the global south are made up of a lot of people who are just naive and just don't have the literacies or understandings of what this actually entails, right? Or is it that you've just not gotten there yet because it's part of the digital divide and they really have to get to where we're at to understand the devastating impacts of new technologies, right? In fact, conversations I just had with some very senior UN officials, because I'm part of a number of UN committees, she was really struggling. And she said, is it even morally right for me to connect the unconnected? Because how can I bring all these poor people online, or facilitate policies to bring them online when basically I'm feeding them into the extraction machine? Now, you have to understand the perversity of this sort of thinking, because basically the UN says the digital connectivity is a right. This could be significant in the way in which we enable people to come online. And besides, if we don't see it as a right, basically what we're saying is, you know what, why don't you just stay at home, lock the doors because you are really safe there. Meantime, I will roam around in the dangerous public space, because I will have much more of the capacities to deal with these risks. But I, in my paternalistic sort of emotive logic, will relegate you in your little closed, doors. Now, you have to understand these are very good intentions, which can go really bad, right? So this is the real reason why we need to really rethink the way in which these sentiments are prevailing, because this pessimism logic can create extremely corrosive approaches to our everyday lives. Now, the fact is that it starts from a number of positions. One is that there's a lot of misunderstandings about the global south, because people are like, well, it's not about the fact that they are illiterate, they're naive, far from it. In fact, it is the bigger picture is, a much more complex one, which is framed through three components. One is demographics, the other is culture, and third is growth. So demographics, it helps to understand that 90% of the world's youth live outside the West. That's the majority of the youth. That's the majority of markets already. Just India and China alone make up for the majority of users today, and they haven't even reached market saturation, right? So in the last decade, a lot of massive disruptions have happened with the next billion user market, which has made data from some of the most expensive in the world in countries like India, China, and elsewhere to the cheapest in the world. So that has brought enormous number of young people online, and then just not it's not just that they've been come online, they are intensely consuming this. So the average person in China spends 2 to 3 times more time online than those in than a kid in Boston or even in Sydney or Melbourne. So there's the intensity, and there's a reason for this, right? Let's add another layer to it, because it's very tempting to say, well, aren't they just the cosmopolitan elites, and then it's like the Saskia Sassen thing, it's like the global cities, global elites, it's like one giant bubble. Not so, actually. Much of these populations are coming from tier 2, tier 3 towns, actually, which is not necessarily the main cosmopolitan areas. And they are the most enthusiastic. This includes China and India, as we see Indonesia, Vietnam, we see many of these, Nigeria. And part of the reason is because they are so far away from city life and the varieties of access to social services and a variety of other opportunities and cultural opportunities, that even more so they want to be connected online. They want to be part of the global citizenry, right? So in fact, they did these, BBC did a massive survey across different countries and found that the young people who were in more marginalized settings in the global south were counted or call themselves as a global citizen, something like 70 to 85%. And countries in Europe, particularly in Northern Europe and elsewhere in the West, said they didn't see themselves as global citizens. So, for example, Italy and Germany ranked as the lowest as considering themselves as global citizens. It's well worth noting that people who see themselves as global citizens probably will never leave their hometown, like an informal settlement. That is going to be the environment for the rest of their lives. And yet they have that affinity of, the imagined communities, let's just say, getting in a retro way in this context, right? So you have this demographic angle. It's interesting because I was at one of the sort of conversations I keep having with so many academics. And I had this at Cambridge University, where a professor got really offended. And this is something that we'll talk a little more about, the culture of offense now in academia. We have lost this art of dialogue. He got offended because what about the last mile? What about the last group of the unconnected? Why aren't you talking about that? When you speak about the next billion users, you're basically saying the global south should not be focusing on those poor people who need food and water, etc., right? It's like saying that you cannot talk about the US if you don't talk about abortions, gun control, Trump, otherwise you just can't speak about it, right? Same thing with Chinese logic, right? You cannot talk about China unless you bring in the social credit score, the Uyghurs, etc., and then you can talk about it. We have to be able to have multiple conversations about certain contexts and people, without coming up with these caveats of, okay, I signal that I understand all these contexts before I go into it, right? Which, as we know, we have a word limit. So, that's the demographic. Then there's this cultural aspect, is what we, fail to grasp oftentimes, because we are in 5% of the liberal democracies in the world, is that we've gotten so used to taking our institutions for granted that we don't realize the statistic really should hit home. We are less than 5% of the world's countries have liberal democracies. Majority of the world lives in a spectrum of paternalistic, cultures to hardcore authoritarian to even war zone-like areas. So you have this full spectrum, and again, underlining paternalism does not necessarily mean it's something which is imposed upon. Citizens may actually choose to want a paternalistic state like Singapore. Most of the rest of the world wants to be a Singapore and not the United States. In fact, not everybody is crazy about democracy. Because the way democracy, liberal democracy, is played out in many of these contexts has not really helped them in that many regards, versus when they look at the model of Singapore versus the US. Oh, hang on. Let's say they have much more access to healthcare versus the United States, or much more, there's less homelessness, or there's less crime. And you start to go down these points, and then it's about quality of life, right? And participation in elections and politics is one aspect of quality of life, but we can't help but talk about it as an entirety of what democracy is, right? And this does not mean that people don't value democratic values. I mean, they go on the street, they put their lives online for it. It's just that we have to understand the complexities of it and the trade-offs of what it ensures. Nuance is something that I'm really trying to advocate for. The other layer, not just in terms of paternalism, right, is in terms of patriarchy. So majority of the countries in the world today treat women as second-class citizens. And how could we not, focus on that, right? So when they go online, there's a different kind of gender dynamic. Women and girls can't optimize the attention economy the way, males can, because the moment you reach a particular visibility point, you're considered a loose woman. We've done a 3.5-year research project in many different areas in India, for example, with my team in FemLab, a Feminist Future Work initiative I started with Usha Raman from University of Hyderabad a couple of years ago. And we found that many of the girls are even now embracing the idea that it is, to be a good girl, you should be offline. But actually, they have this deep aspiration to also be online. So they justify it as saying, we want to check out what the bad girls are doing, right? So we can actually condemn them and stay away from them. So it's a very interesting sort of logic. So they'll do everything to get online and lurk and use their brother's mobile phones and their father's mobile phones. And there's an entire world of usage which is beyond our imagination, because we look at them as a monolithic group. And oftentimes we have easy access to boys and men when we're doing, digital divide research, because it's much harder to get women and girls to talk to you. In fact, the next billion users, my first decade of research, I think it was disproportionately male. And I actually would put that as a caveat, and I said, okay, that's why we set up this FemLab, because I said, okay, it takes enormous amounts of energy and academic resources and time. It's far less incentivizing for academics to publish, because for this amount of time you have when you go with your grant money in the field, it's just easier. You check some boxes. Okay, yes, fine, it's hard to get these girls, or if their mother-in-law is always around, so you get shitty data, right? So because it's not like it's filtered through her or filtered through the husband or the brother. So screw this, it's just not worth it. At least I've got the income inequality check, the maybe throw in the religious dimension, and I've got the intersectionality, right? Gender work is just extraordinarily hard, and it will remain hard because patriarchal systems are sticky systems. In fact, we see them, look at Afghanistan, we've gotten back in time, right? And in fact, even more so, why they're optimistic, because a case like in Afghanistan, where women and girls literally have gone back into medieval times, where they don't have any access to public space, they've been dehumanized with their hijabs, and they can't even access salon services because it's considered by the Taliban as political spaces. So when they are at home, they are very excited about being online to feel human again, to feel connected to a public space. And of course, they understand the risks, but the benefits far outweigh the risks, because it makes them feel like a sense of belonging, right? So if we can keep these in consideration while we approach, it will be very useful. Moreover, another thing that I keep hearing again and again is, look, there's a lot of, we're going to do good. We're going to do a lot of good in the West, and then it's going to trickle down to the rest, right? And in the last few years, particularly with my Next Billion Users book, every tech company approached me. My life really changed around. It's like from Spotify, Adobe, name it. I think they just wanted me to deliver the next billion users to them. They're like, we need that market and we don't understand these people. Can you just like quickly tell us how to get that data and just, you know? So it was fascinating because I from a regular academic, I became this, infused in this tech world. Normally it's impossible to penetrate. And here they're giving me this red carpet. And as I had discussions more and more with them, they're like, yeah, so our focus really is to, bring quality products, to them. And it's all about bringing stuff to them. And I'm like, you understand that your systems of finance are really like a decade old, right? I mean, they should. So here are three examples. One is Angami from the Middle East. It is going to be in the next decade, the Angami is going to take over the music industry in ways which, especially in the global south, which again is the majority world, because they think about music differently. Unlike, say, the Western logic of music as for consumption, not a space of sociality, dialogue, live streaming, a complexity of services connected to fintech, and a variety of other options. And Angami starts from the fact is that people are used to a piracy culture. Majority of the world have not ever paid for music, right? Not even subsidy. So you have to do some serious value addedness if you have to get this product right, and you have to convince people to pay for it. I mean, do you remember a decade of media on, movie theaters saying it's a crime, piracy is a crime? It didn't work. Like, they were so panicky until even the media industry said, okay, let's stop thinking in terms of let's stop criminalizing it and turn it around and say, let's look at it as market research, right? So, and then it started to benefit them actually. So they stopped looking at piracy as a threat. Same thing with Microsoft, right? For a decade, they tried to sue the hell out of people who were, doing stuff which is like, using their service. And then they realized, hang on, this open source thing actually works to our advantage. So it's a fascinating shift. But Angami is already there and is already fast growing. I mean, just to think about the way in which Spotify labels like the rest of the world music as world music, right? And Angami, it's like just the categories of it is so much more nuanced. And that's just one example. Second is, about, autonomous vehicles. I mean, it should give us pause when a couple of years ago, Elon Musk, who is by many still considered as the epitome of future innovations, right? Was interviewed by the New York Times and was asked, so what do you think about the autonomous vehicles coming from China? And he's like, he started to laugh. He's like, have you seen those cars, right? That's like, I think 5 years ago. Today, he's begging Europe and the US to ban them. He literally said, if we allow them, they're going to destroy our auto industry. That's quite a turn, right? And it also should give you pause that he wants to make Twitter as the next WeChat, which has been around for a decade. What does that say about it? So basically, and I've just come from Shanghai, and anyone who's been to China should understand and know that they're already 2 decades ahead, from autonomous vehicles to fintech, and even in India, right? India has pioneered the largest digital public infrastructure in the world. And that is something commendable because that should have happened in Europe. Europe has been trying to do that. It's extraordinarily wealthy. It was dedicated, and it has this unique consolidation of all these countries. And they do believe in public services, unlike the United States, right? And they failed to do that because there's too many regional politics, and the Indian government, along with tech industry, made it happen. What does that actually mean is the digital public infrastructure circumvents the mafiadom of iOS and Android, which takes a ridiculous cut for any entrepreneur, which makes being a digital entrepreneur enormously hard, right? So here, anyone with a good idea can set up their own company on this digital public infrastructure. So I sit on this board for the last 2 years, and I'll be on it for the next a couple of years on the digital economy board for the Indian government. And I, again, went to Cambridge recently, and some people in the audience said, I am complicit with a fascist regime, right? Because don't you understand what the Indian government is? All right, so I said, okay, so you're saying there's not a single person in there that is worth collaborating with. So if you work with the states of a fascist regime, then you're basically complicit, which means I should just stop working with 95% of the world. We should just, stay within our boundaries and let the world take care of itself. Like we can be insulated, right? And if you really want change, you have to identify critical change makers from within. So if you don't engage with states, you don't engage with a tech company because they are made up of people. And one thing I've learned over these last decades working with all these different sets, it's so easy to judge from the top, but actually beneath the layers, a lot of good people are trying to do good work. Even in China, when I came, it's like there's a reason the streets are clean, there are side paths, they've embraced autonomous vehicles, the pollution has gone down, there's a lot of public libraries. If we can't state these things without a caveat, then we are really missing out on, having a productive conversation. China is also, and here's a line that basically I was at Ivy League college last year, and I gave this line, and they asked me if I wanted to delete it from the video before putting it up, right? So I'm going to say that line here. So it's basically, I said that we should at least acknowledge that China, in a decade, brought out the most number of poor people, out of poverty through, and particularly leveraging on innovative ways of doing so, like understanding that proxies for credit, right, which is social credit score, which has been sort of demonized through Black Mirror, etc., where people are like, oh my God, this is crazy. But actually what it was is, look, it's a post-communist regime. People don't have assets. Banks won't lend to people because they need reassurance. So you need to come up with proxies, which, by the way, every bank industry, every insurance industry across the West does and uses, is you assess behaviors to understand whether that person is trustworthy and you can give them a loan. That's really about it, right? And that was one of the single pathways that China used to get people out of poverty. And so I can go on. And the last example is about AI being used in many countries in Africa to basically make textbooks for children, like storybooks for children, accessible in their own languages. So they're printing it, they're using AI and also generative media to create like content. And they are very excited about this, right? How am I doing with time? 15 minutes, is that?
Yeah.
Yeah. So just here's some examples. Now, so let's go back to, oh, that was blank. But basically the question, right, about when I asked you, is AI taking our jobs? Here, meet Neil Renaud. They are basically a village influencer in a tier 2 town in India. And the way in which they're able to capitalize on their audience is to use their local materials and respond to global trends. Remember, I brought up about this global citizenship feeling? That's Neil Renaud, and that's an example of many such influencers and creators in the in emerging economies and the global South, which is, by the way, the majority of the future of the creator economy, who are deeply enthusiastic about digital media, about understanding the metrics, using AI to become hyper productive because it takes 8 to 10 hours to produce content. Now it has been reduced. It's extraordinarily laborious. So AI can really help in generating visuals and, so as to constantly get that content. And just to underline, Neil Renaud has more followers than most fashion brands in the world today. So that's just one of the examples, right? And I did this major project on, creators, and basically they've rejected, technologies like Adobe, and they've embraced Canva. Canva is basically, for those who don't know, was considered the poor person's, Adobe, right? And it was looked upon in extraordinarily condescending terms. In fact, people like, oh my God, this is destroying creativity. It's so crass, etc. It was too easy to use, right? You didn't have to go through that rite of passage. And the founder, this woman from Australia, I believe, right? And she was rejected, 100 times, 150 times. In the end, she had to get some money from her friends and family. And now she is a serious competitor to Adobe. that's something to, take note. It's because she wasn't condescending about, the majority world. She realized majority world wants to get on and make content immediately. And that's exactly what a lot of the creators we analyzed in tier 2, tier 3 towns across many parts of India, is they wanted to be free. They wanted to hit the ground running. It has to be easy to learn. And they're very proud of being self-taught. And they learn as you go. You don't want some course. You don't want to go through a whole 3-year program, etc., because technologies are moving fast, right? And they want free trials. And what they like is they appreciate social linguistic diversity. So they use multiple apps to create content. The indigenous apps in India, and then the clean foreign app of Instagram, for example, right? Second is AI threatening our democracy. Here's an example by Iranian women activists using generative media to come up with content which is provocative, but really underlining their message that women need to be able to do what they want in public space and wear what they want without putting actual people in harm's way. These people don't exist, right? And so this is enabling a sort of a new kind of political activism online through audiovisual, content, which is, safer for the protesters. Here is Miranda's content, an Bolivian artist who is disrupting the stereotypes about indigenous communities in Latin America, where the idea of sports and indigenous communities and women and sports, etc., and being playful and using this content, right? One can actually amplify it through synthetic data, and thereby you can populate the algorithms to sort of get debiased, right? So that's quite a sort of a twist of logic, but basically algorithms per se, which we've sort of absorbed, almost uncritically now, because I've yet to see really any deep critique about the algorithms of oppression. In fact, just the fact of because I think it's too sacred. We have now a lot of sacred words in academia, right? You cannot possibly criticize algorithms of oppression because you're racist, of course, right? So, but here's the thing, it's algorithms are not racist. It's the data that is completely skewed and biased, and you can fix it, right? Because if you start to populate and create content and use the technologies at your disposal to create, amplify that content, and so populate it in a way to sort of measure the biases. And also, it's not a one-off thing. You need to constantly work on the data to ensure that it is in alignment with the values we hold dear, So we need to have auditing mechanisms. These are all the boringness of things, which doesn't make for good academic articles or, clickbait articles. It's better to just say that algorithms are racist and just be done with it. But then here's a question. What about Black Lives Matter? Did a racist algorithm promote Black Lives Matter? All these sort of paradoxes just get written off as paradoxes of, the privacy paradox, as if it's a question to analyze. That's because we've created this nice little bubble where this is an untouchable concept. And then we can explain everything else as learned helplessness, the paradox of things, etc., which of course will lead us to very different directions. Also, by critiquing, the notion of algorithms are racist doesn't mean that I'm disregarding the fact that they are racial outputs. And there's a difference, right? But oftentimes when I say something like that, so this is something I've also gotten very used to. When I say, oh, we need to be optimistic, they're like, oh, so you dismiss all the concerns and harms. And that's interesting. You translate it into that way. So I can also put it the other way. I'm like, oh, you're very pessimistic. So you're going to give your mobile phone to me, right? And your laptop, because why would you subject yourself to such extraordinary extraction and harm? I feel for you, right? Why can't I do that? I've lost my AirPods, so I'm hoping somebody who is pessimistic will give me theirs. So, and this is another example of for example, we've done work in Nigeria, and a lot of countries in Africa are young democracies that have a lot of protocols, particularly because of the elderly in politics. So majority of the leaders, which seems to be a trend now, plus 65, 70, right? And it seems like the norm. The ticket to politics is make sure you have one leg in the, death door or something to, be the voice of the majority youth. So for them, face-to-face politics doesn't work, but online it seems they can say things and criticize policies in ways that can be much more powerful, and also using audiovisual content. And the AI has been very useful in gaming the metrics, right? And last is social media bad for mental health? I've had a bit of a clash with Jonathan Haidt, who has been, promoting how devastating social media is for our mental health while he does that on social media, of course. As with most of the pessimism, techno-pessimists we have out there, who love to tell their followers how horrible the world is, right? So, one of the things is that with, if you think about the report on Instagram, the whistleblower, and it says, okay, Instagram is creating significant harm. In the same report, by the way, was also that twice the number of young people found a lot of, solidarity online. And this is, I'm talking about the official report that even The Economist and other outlets covered. So it's not like I'm a big fan of Meta, by the way. I think they're one of the shittier companies out there, right? But the fact is that it is both realities are true. Why can't our brains allow for that? If us as academics cannot enable more than, like, if we can't go beyond the binary, then what hope do we have of the rest of the world, right? Of society in general. So we need to break out of our own binary cult. So here's an example, as I did this year-long project with UNHCR, and my team in Brazil was working with Venezuelan refugees, and they were so extraordinarily enthusiastic. And here's just a snippet of their enthusiasm. It's like, this is, a woman who was a Venezuelan refugee in Brazil. My dream is to make videos because my story is hard to tell. I had 2 heart attacks and God raised me up. There are things I want the world to understand. And so many of them want to be influencers. They want to learn about generative media. They want to capture themselves. They are far from opting out. They want to opt in, right? And another is a homosexual Venezuelan actor, a guy, and he said, a picture I took expressing that I felt very lonely. The picture made it to the top. 20 people loved it. I liked that picture because it was with that picture I understood that I have to value myself as a person. So Jonathan Haidt, in the meantime, says social media was one of the single worst things to happen to humankind, and that we would have been better off without it completely. In fact, he's become so powerful that he's actually shifted policy, like where they're banning TikTok, which of course is very easy for the geopolitics between China and US. Why not just target a company coincidentally? Why would we hinder, the American businesses when we can just target a Chinese app because we care about mental health, right? So why not consistency? Anyway, that, moving geopolitics aside, is that there is a reason that we need to understand why refugees, just like most of the marginalized populations, are enthusiastic about social media, because it enables them to connect, build networks outside their little worlds. It enables them to potentially monetize their content, gives them new forms of livelihood and opportunities, and a variety of other ways to humanize, build solidarities, and all that has substance. In fact, it allows us to sustain our humanity, and that does have value. So when we dismiss it, it's because we have multiple other institutions in place that we take for granted, right? This is also the romance economy, which is extraordinarily powerful, and one of the single biggest drivers of why people get on the internet and stay on the internet. In fact, it's not just romance, it's porn, right? I do this thing when I go give talks at festivals. I ask, how many of you all do not watch porn? And you see hands are like, oh. So people are not willing to like lie, but and so it's almost nobody. And I'm talking about, I was in Copenhagen, Berlin, Hamburg. I've been in so many countries, and I can say maybe thousands and thousands of people, like maybe 3-4 people actually raise their hands. But the thing is, porn is a gateway to sexuality because most of these countries, as I mentioned, are very conservative, right? They don't talk about sex. Sex doesn't exist. Forget sex. Menstruation doesn't exist. Women, girls learn about it by just, it happening to them. And then they have to figure it out. And then they're given some pad. I mean, most people don't get to understand what this is. The families are not talking to them, their friends, the institutions, media. So when you're in this total silence, how else do you understand what sex and sexuality is, or sensuality or intimacy? And mind you, 98% of young people in the global south will have an arranged marriage, right? So they will probably, many of them will never sleep with somebody or even have any kind of intimacy, sexual intimacy with anyone before marriage. Okay, so this is the way, almost a decade of research in multiple contexts have given us huge amounts of evidence showing that people have full-blown online relationships with different people and have breakup, but it gives them confidence to go into an arranged marriage, which is also very fascinating. They'll never meet those people, but they've had relationships and they've learned, what it is to be in a relationship. So what, right? So it's like we should be more optimistic. But as academics, what are the consequences? Can we break out of, the sacredness? Like, there's so many, studies, like worlds in academia, which has become so singularly pessimistic. You take about surveillance studies. The word surveillance is, instinctively negative, right? Of course, it's all about control and oppress, right? But what about the surveillance of care, right? Where it's about not watching each other, it's watching over one another, right? And that makes a real difference. And that actually has an impact. And if we look at the women's groups, why they track each other online in Mexico, where extraordinarily high amounts of female femicides take place, right? So they do use it and they share their location. They want to be tracked. Many of women who don't have safe public spaces, which by the way is a majority of the world, wants to be tracked by others so they feel a little safer, okay? So it's not a singular narrative of surveillance as, oppressive. Another sort of, I mean, we've already talked about the anxious generation, but say data grab, I just got back from a festival in Republica where, again, what was interesting, so this media, the German radio, took my talk and pitted my talk against everything else at the Republica Festival, saying, oh, this is so interesting, this book is, creating a counter argument to the rest of the critique out there, which again underlines my point is if I say something good about something does not translate to dismissing the harms and risks, because they're all like, that is, we have to break out of the logic. With data grab, and other such books, by the way, on promoting data colonialism. Now, data colonialism has become almost it's no longer treated like a concept, it's treated like a fact. But what does that actually mean? So you listen to what Nick Holdry and Ulysses is saying, and saying that we have completely lost control over our data, ourselves, and our bodies. And that it's basically we are in a colonial, data colonial space because we are constantly being extracted, which, by the way, is a very dangerous metaphor to use, because that means that majority of people's motivations to come online are being dismissed. Why, if you're drawing parallels, that means people under the colonial era, right, of 2 centuries, did not basically, they wanted either we use a tech logic and say, no, they really wanted to be colonized because they're getting all these benefits, right? I mean, after all, the railways, for example, right? And so, or we flip the script and say that no, data colonialism is extraordinarily violent and oppressive and extractive, and it was disproportionately not bottom-up motivated. And it cannot be used as a legitimate metaphor to understand our digital motivations and usage, because much of it is bottom-up. People are extraordinarily enthusiastic. They want to stay on the internet. In fact, those who are the most pessimistic are also on the internet. They are using all the services, and I want to just keep underlining that. Their, algorithms of oppression, Sophia Noble was literally on stage with an Apple Watch. And why do we not see this as something which is ironic? Why have we fallen in love with these theories and feel that we as academics can circumvent the hypocrisies and double standards because we've woven a really good story because we can, right? Through our clever narrative. So I think it's just time we break out of this sort of pessimism bubble, because it's a moral imperative to hope. It's not an option, because if we continue in this trend, we're going to create extraordinarily devastating policies, designs, which are going to actually hurt the rest of the world. And, maybe in some regards, they will be fine because the US, for example, was very dominant. They used to capture something like 85% of the market. But today, that was a couple of decades ago, today it's less than 43%. So you can say, yes, the damage will be less, but we really do have a moral imperative to change our mindset and start with a position of hope, because we are really, as I say this again and again, it is pessimism is a privilege for those who can afford to live with despair. The rest of the world has no option but to be rational optimists, because they know in order to change the world, they need to engage and take control. And there's only one way to do this is through the lens of hope, right? So, all right, thank you.
Thank you so much, Payal, for a wonderfully provocative and dense talk. That was just excellent. So we will move to questions in the room and online. If you are watching online, please sign in to your Google account and enjoy the promise of doing so that you can actually give us the text question. That will take a couple minutes, so the quicker you do it, the sooner Lauren will be able to feed it back to us. So we'll let that go now, but I'm happy to take some questions from the group, and I'll just grab some microphones for that. I have a list of my own, some of which you already answered, but yeah, stand here and I'll run. Absolutely. Question to start, yeah, and maybe just introduce yourself.
Hi, I'm Anthony McClusker, Professor of Communication at Swinburne University. Thanks for the fantastic talk, and it's really, I don't want to say that it's refreshing, but we're kind of right in the middle of this battle, I think, around what's been called criti hype, like just this oscillation between the criticism and the hype, and it's hard to actually steer a course. This is what you're saying, of course. It's hard to steer a course through those two poles. We get kind of pulled one way or another, and positioned one way or another. I just wondered if you could say a little bit more about what kind of research, what kind of evidence, what kind of creative thinking can academics do to, and collaborations, I guess, do and work on to try to manage that pathway through those poles, if that makes sense.
Yes, absolutely. I think that's a really good question, because it cements the fact that we as academics need to change the way we look at ourselves, because I think our job was to criticize, particularly from the humanities. Let me underline who we talk, the humanities and the social sciences, because obviously business school and economics schools, like, they have a different logic. They are optimistic, right? So that they're not the audience. So I think the humanities does need to change, because one, that some of the biggest questions and challenges about new technologies are really social questions. And humanities should actually be the leader in helping answer these questions. The second is that we've gotten into a habit to start our research from critique, fair enough, right? And end with critique, and only at the end we're like, yes, we need change. This is really critique is activism in a way, right? I'm an academic activist. I want to create change. But we leave it in a way where people feel really paralyzed. It's like, it's almost like it's too oppressive to change. So one, and secondly, we don't set even a pathway to change. So I think we have to come up with a different starting point. rather than like investing, because at this stage, I think so many, as you've seen in a decade, look at the titles. Just go to a academic bookstore and look at the book titles and tell me one positive book which comes from the humanities, just one. Okay, I challenge you to find one. Okay, and I think that's a problem. It's like we've gotten into the business of fear and depression. And I think we need to start from a position of, okay, we know this is a critique, and our energies can be best spent on how do we transform this. So concretely, for example, I'm working with my team on with Adobe on a debiasing of creative data. And that is actually an interesting project, because and we're working with creative people in multiple global South countries, and we're giving them prompts and asking them to generate visual data and to also label them in their own terms. And then we have a workshop in how do they understand these labels, why do they label it in those terms, and then we populate it, right? But we are already undergoing enormous amounts of challenges. For example, is our main role to be authentic to populations? What does representation mean? And what is authenticity? Because that's where the tech industry comes from. They want authenticity. And I've realized that as I've been doing this field work in the we've just started like 2 weeks, authenticity really should be shelved, because we're never going to be authentic. What we need to do is a diversity of representation. We have to widen that spectrum, but authenticity is beyond our reach. Then it puts us in that role to dictate what is authentic about a particular population as we mediate these worlds. And this is just one of the examples which can be extraordinarily exciting for academics, to think these things through. Or what is ethical data collection, right? What is fair value? When we engage with them to produce this content, what value do they get, right? This is great for philosophers or AI ethicists. And so I'm just saying that let's engage and channel our mental energies on productive actions which can create change, because we really need, in fact, the industry really needs us, desperately so. We just need to get on board, and we need a new skill set to enable that collaboration, right?
I'm just going to have a first, but you can hold that. Thank you so much. I really enjoy the counter critique here, and it's a comment, it's not a question. You start with the leading critiques of AI and digital tools, especially with the AI and racism and surveillance capitalism, and Jonathan's recent book on the anxiety generation. I was expecting you would, engage with them and critique their argument. You didn't do that. That's fine. But my view is that the two claims can be true at the same time. You are saying AI is positive in generating positive outcomes for global South. I agree with that. I'm from Ethiopia. My brothers live in rural Ethiopia. They are benefiting out of the connectivity. But at the same time, I also see the arguments by the surveillance capitalism and AI and racism. Those are also true at the same time, because I remember a story, I think from the States, is how the police surveillance camera captured the wrong guy, black guy, and that guy went through hell because he was not the criminal, but because the AI, all blacks are criminals, therefore this guy is black, he's a criminal. So how would you do, would you judge if that author is pessimist towards AI, or if that person is pessimist towards AI and surveillance? And also the surveillance capitalism, that book is about Google and all these big tech companies are generating capital out of your free data. Again, that's true. Is that, at least that's true for the global north. Mm-hmm. And if you see Jonathan's book, he's also arguing that young people are suffering from mental health as a result of too much access to social media. He presents the emergence of iPhone in social media. He has statistical data to show that. It's really hard to disqualify that as a problem. Yes, we can say AI is generating benefits for global south. That's true, but without negating the previous argument. Thank you.
Thank you. So here's a question for you, right? Would you call yourself a person who gets sad?
Sad?
Yeah, do you get sad?
Of course, I am human. I do.
Do you get happy?
Yeah.
Do you go between the two? Do you get sometimes sad and then you get happy? Very boring, stupid questions, right? I'm asking you.
No, that's fine. But yeah, this is
Okay. That's what my point is, that this is a complexity where they have to coexist because multiple truths are coexisting at the same time. And the danger is that because any technology will yield the entire spectrum of our human imagination as well as their human capabilities, which can be from the most altruistic, most generous, most fulfilling and great for our well-being to the most devastating, harmful, toxic, outcomes. So to focus though, and the main, of course, I didn't stay on these books because of the time limit, but I do go deep into each and every book because each book disproportionately focuses, and this is also academia in general, we put 95 to 98% of our energies on all what's wrong. And when you create a narrative of that kind, you basically are not denying that. You're like, yes, it's good, but there's all this harm and risk, which is 98%. And what it does is the matter of emphasis creates a kind of reality, which basically puts us in that position that thereby technology is toxic, technology should be controlled, technology is not good for us. Social media is not good for us, which results in policies like banning of social media, and very extreme positions because you get fearful of these technologies. So, and then you cannot, for the life of God, understand why majority of the world are optimistic about it. So you start to look at the most of the world in condescending terms. So my only argument is actually a very boring argument, is that we've got to stop treating AI as if it's a weapon of destruction, etc. But it's like every damn new technology. We've had this conversation before when the radio came about, when the television, oh my God, the television is going to ruin family life. Nobody's ever going to talk to one another. And then television studies reveal that actually it created some amounts of real social bonding because, we all have families. We really have sometimes nothing in common. We want to argue, or you want to keep the peace, and what better than to argue about some stupid television show, right? And have a sort of a social moment does not also undermine the fact that we do go into binge watching, but also doesn't disregard the fact that I may get real meaning if it is showing my kind of people online, and I'm like, oh wow, I feel seen and heard. And all those are true, right? So we just have to ensure that these technologies work for us more, and we need to reduce the harms. And the thing is, these are very banal truths, that it's like another technology. It needs guardrails. And I can go into the boringness of things, but with a pessimistic mindset, which a lot of these books, double down on, we ask different kinds of questions, we dedicate our energies towards different kinds of, pursuits, and we have this feeling that we can't seem to do much about it. And that is a very dangerous precedent. And we cannot, for the life of God, understand or forget, even empathize why the rest of the world even think like that, except in condescending terms. And that is really the core of my argument. So.
Hi, thank you. I'm Minoli. I'm from Sri Lanka. I'm a PhD candidate, and I look at EdTech in the global south, complexities of implementing it. So I'm 100% with you in terms of the actual complexities of tech within the global south, and often the positive outcomes aren't necessarily the outcomes envisioned by the big tech that's actually implementing them. All of that, 100% with you on that. My question has more to do with acts of resistance. So in the field, there are acts of resistance coming from within communities, created by communities, that is often in response to the way they feel oppressed or objectified or however through these tech forms. So I was wondering, where do you see resistance falling on the spectrum of pessimism and promise? Or does it belong there? Does it not? Like essentially that?
Yeah, absolutely. So look, resistance can come. As I've also already brought up one of the examples, right, with the Iranian women activists. So it happens through movements, of course, and the platform and infrastructures enable these kinds of viralities of both kinds, of course, misinformation and this kind. So again, both are true, right? And so there's when we talk about resistance studies, there's again a disproportionate emphasis on the bottom up. And I think resistance can also happen from the top down. So for example, the Indian government coming up with the digital public infrastructure, what's actually happening in India is it's in partnership with the biggest venture capital company for emerging markets, which is called Process, we call NASPER. And they've got this unusual alliance because they're trying to resist big tech, because big tech is so enormously deep with their resources. So, and they want the market to start working again, because with big tech hyper monopolies, the market's not working, right? And so they want entrepreneurship to happen. So in that sense, I consider it resistance because it's resisting another entity. So we need to see resistance at multiple levels of power and not just from the bottom up, because then it can also be that, so the limits of this surveillance capitalism logic, for one of the arguments, right, is it's a very Americanized logic, because it is true in the US where tech companies and the industry, like the market, has disproportionate power, right? Has extreme wealth. Whereas if you go to countries like, say, in India, China, etc., there's more partnerships. Actually, India has this legacy of partnering with the tech industry to operationalize, social good services, which comes from the sort of colonial times, working with industries like Tata Industries. Their corporate social responsibility means something very different, right? And so, and sometimes the tech companies can actually be seen by users as the only formidable force against an authoritarian regime. Like, for example, in Russia, where certain tech companies pushed against the Russian forces, or where you can access it through VPN. Doesn't mean that sometimes tech companies are not complicit. Like in Ethiopia, again, many tech companies are complicit with the government to enable oppression, but they can also in India stand down because they stand against the state, right? By saying, no, we will not, like in India, the case in point where the protesters, where they demanded Twitter to provide the details, and they said no. Or say, for example, where Facebook has denied Pakistan data on users who said something about the Quran. So I think this whole notion of the main bad actor being the tech industry, again, is very simplistic. Again, context matters. And it is really important about looking at multiple levels for resistance studies, looking at multiple contexts and cross-cultural analysis for us to really break out of this. I'm dedicated to seeing this as a bad actor, this as a good actor, or all bottom-up engagements are just generally, fuzzy and good. Well, that's also the alt-right. They are bottom-up, right? Misinformation movements are bottom-up. Shouldn't we celebrate them because they have all the check boxes? They were organic. They did a lot of community-based learning and teaching. They used digital technology. They brought their children. They did all the good things. And then they want to promote like something like destroy the world or whatever. Or women are like, should be like in the guardianship system or something like that in Saudi Arabia. So, yeah. So I think as academics, every time we get too close and fall too deeply in love with a particular concept, let's do an exercise of come up with 3 horrible things about that concept, just to keep us on check, because we do love to fall in love. We seem to just have fallen hard in love with certain concepts, and we're unable to be academics, in that sense. So.
More questions? Excuse me, sorry.
Yeah. Thank you so much for the conversation and really stinging us into some extra thought. As I hear you mention that we can be happy sometimes and sad others, and that there are multiple levels of context, thinking about my own work, I wonder if at sometimes it's more a continuum of thinking, and I can be both simultaneously, sometimes a bit mid, sometimes a bit ambivalent. And for me, I'm less in one camp than another. So for any issue, I might say, I see this in quite a positive way. And my sense is that academics have written about the positive aspects for a while, probably more in journal articles, thinking of Jenkins' work on virtual communities in the early days, and fan cultures for what they afford for users in different ways. And I can see the positivity there. I can see negative aspects, but does it have to be at the extremes of the binary? Can it not be the continuum of thinking that exists on any issue at a multiple time is a question here. And I, forgive me, I know that this is a very rushed conversation, but there's so much to unpack, and we look forward to that.
I think it's actually a very good question. It's funny because I just fill out an evaluation. I'm on a program committee to evaluate some at a university in the Netherlands. And one of the things I've made as a critique when I'm going through their thesis is that I realize that, so one of the things that students now do is say, I'm going to take on this concept or this theoretical framework, and then I'm going to apply it, right? This indiscriminate application is a problem, but choosing a point of a vantage point of your of your belief system, shall we say, is not a problem actually, because we all have to start somewhere. So I feel very strongly, say I want to take a feminist lens, right? But I have to also recognize what that entails, and I have to make it overt and reflexive of how people have critiqued that particular lens. And yet I need to stand by my approach, but then I need to engage with the data, and the data always comes first. If the data tells me something different, I need to go back to revise my most beloved position, even if it hurts, right? And I think that's where we are unable to do this. And I've had conversations with students that have been so frustrated because they've interviewed users who are from Vietnam, for example, who are very enthusiastic about e-commerce. And then they came up to me and said, it just won't fit my surveillance capitalism theory. What should I do? It's like, I can't complete the thesis. And I was like, then, that's great. So that's part of your analysis. So I think that is really, when I started my PhD at Columbia, I remember going to Gayatri Spivak's lecture, and she gave me 2 seconds and with scorn, but I still remember that, is I went up to her and said, so what theoretical framework should I choose? Shall I choose yours? And she's like, she probably thought I was the most disgusting spectacle to ask the stupidest question, because she had that on her face. And she's like, you don't come here to choose a theoretical construct. The data creates the theoretical construct. And so if you're asking me this question, you shouldn't belong here. I was like, oh my God, she's anyway. But it stuck in my head. I was like, yes, because we want to feel that we want to hold on to that, and we start with that positioning. But it's really important to recognize, one, be overt with where we are starting. And that's something, because we all have a starting point, and I think it's essential. And we can choose different theoretical constructs, and that itself, the bricolage, creates our own kind of approach, which is nuanced, but is perfectly okay. And as long as we keep that reflexivity going, actually.
I'll take Sabi Chair's prerogative just for a second. I think that's really interesting. Again, I'll get to you in 1 sec. Comment/question. When you think of how the hard sciences, the technical sciences that are building the tech, right, or use concepts, it's through falsification. They're trying to falsify this, like hard science, or it's trying to falsify whatever theoretical starting point they're on. Like that's our understanding of what science does. Yet on the humanities side, right, as you've explained, sometimes that gets inverted, and we try to hold on to that theoretical concept despite the evidence. And that happens, of course, I mean, you can go into the Kuhn and all the rest of it. But I thought that was really interesting for two things. One, when you think about, you said, try to find a positive humanities and social sciences book. I was thinking about, in all of the kind of conference paper, journal article stuff of the harder sciences, I used AR to do this, I used AI to do this. A lot of that is more positive, right? Whether it's, fixing an ailment or et cetera, et cetera. So it's really interesting that humanities has, I think, positioned itself in that negative space. And then the second thing is it brought me back to, the debate that's maybe not new, but, it's, do artifacts have politics? Right. And it was this idea that came through the empirical work of looking at the size of buses and the size of overpasses. Right. And it was a racist overpass because the buses that carried people of color couldn't get to the beach. I'm paraphrasing and getting the facts wrong. But this is the point. Someone came back, George's, I think, 20 years later, and said, do politics have artifacts? And the empirical basis of like the height of the buses and the height of the overpasses didn't actually add up. The buses could have probably made it. The reasons the buses went around, and didn't take the Black people to the beach was something else. That was something completely contextual, right? So I think it's a really interesting provocation to us to say, do our politics have artifacts where we see social media, where we see AI, and say, oh, this is the artifact that I shall, right, draw my attention to. So anyway, sorry, that was my chair's prerogative.
Yeah, I really like that. Thank you.
Yeah, I suppose fundamentally what I'm doing is to some degree coming to the defense of I wouldn't say humanities, but probably social sciences. But in saying that, we're talking a lot about nuance, and I understand that what is being presented is a kind of dialectic, kind of antithesis against perceived pessimism in order to produce something different. But I do worry that becomes in and of itself subject to this pessimism, optimism binary and falls into pessimism about whatever we want to call it, humanities, social sciences, whatever. Because I'm not sure, looking at a lot of empirical work, especially in education, and looking at empirical work around data justice, that there isn't that nuance, that there isn't people saying these technologies have negative consequences, but we fundamentally understand the benefits these technologies bring around. What we're trying to work out is how to find a better path through that without throwing the baby out with the bathwater, as it were. And I think that's a difficult thing to do, but that in a sense is why it's worth doing. It has a slightly Sisyphusian quality in that we know we're probably going to fall back down the hill, but that's why we have to keep getting back up. Because ultimately there is a kind of Mark Fisher acid communism type hope that there can be something else, or and a different imaginaries. So I suppose I was wondering how you incorporate those very empirical, very practical, but also theoretical works into your, what feels like to me here at least slightly like a binary, and that pessimism around humanities and arts and social sciences. And then secondarily, just in relation to this idea of reflexivity and having three horrible things, I was wondering how, if we talk about porn, how we then deal with the fact that it is subject, even more so than most media, to the male gaze and the exploitation that happens within that. When we look at the economy and the entrepreneurship that happens through technology, if we look at somebody like Mary Gray, their book around ghost work and the precarity that places a lot of people, particularly in the global south, in, how we deal with that. And then finally, we've touched on the environment, but we've not really talked about the very tangible, very real economic consequences of particularly AI and its water consumption. So when we talk about optimism, the reason we critique, I feel, is to try to find things that are wrong so we can have better solutions. That is hopeful, if not optimistic. And I think I do wonder how you feel optimistic about those three things in your own work as well.
Well, thank you. This is a very richly thought out, set of points. And I mean, I think a couple of things, right? So indeed, there's a reason why humanities is dedicated to critique, because it's like this Michael Moore documentary some time back where he was asked, aren't you being so extreme? I mean, you kind of are oversimplifying the US system, you're overly criticizing it. Noam Chomsky's also been asked the same and all, right? And their argument was that, well, Michael Moore said, I take the pendulum to the extreme because the other side is so extreme, because I know if I go to the other end, there's going to be a middle ground. And my job is to pull the pendulum to the other side. So I deliberately go to the other extreme, right? Academia has, I think, taken on that for a long time. Not academia, humanities, right? Because we are the most critical. We go deep into it, and that's our business, because we see that the others, like business school, et cetera, are far more gung-ho and hyper optimistic, right? And so techno optimistic, and we need to balance that. But I think times have changed because, like I said, we really it's not working, because we need to be part of that conversation, not as an opponent, but as a stakeholder, because the stakes are too high, including the climate crisis. We need to have everyone on board, because regulation doesn't itself work, because there's a lot of loopholes, okay? Beating down tech companies and saying, okay, we're going to fine you X amount of money, right? So the EU ways, regulate, fining. It's got a limited impact, okay, because it's still a drop in the ocean. They have the best of lawyers. So anyway, we don't have to go into that, but the point is that the best way forward, because you have such enormous challenges, and we want to make sure that this round of technology works for us, is that we need to be we need to be at the table and work with these actors. And the problem is that we are unable to have a conversation with them. Unable to have it. We don't have a skill set, because we have learned to stop at the point of critique. We don't know even how to have a common set of terms, language, understandings, empathies. We've demonized everything else because it has suited our extreme points, because it enables us to then balance that pendulum. So all I'm saying is we need to shift. So if we look at the three things that you brought up about porn, for example, yes, porn has enormous amounts of negative, impacts. I mean, I don't even need to state this. Like, of course, it's sort of dehumanizing women, particularly, et cetera, et cetera. Sure. Child pornography, we don't even need to go there. It's clearly some major issue, deep fakes, et cetera, all that stuff. But the fact is that culture is so damn sticky a factor that you go to majority of places in the global south, they literally still don't talk about sex. They just won't. And you're a young person, if 90% of young people live in the global south and nobody's talking to them about sex and sexuality, do you remember how you were as a teenager? It's like, it's all you can think about is, am I a freak, right? Growing up in India, how did I learn about masturbation, for example? I thought I was going to hell, right? When I masturbated for the first time, I thought there was something completely wrong. Me just saying this itself, actually, I've said this in places in India, and they actually, cut it out. Okay, right? And I'm talking about education. From the stream if you want. Exactly. Point is, that I watch porn. Okay, and does that mean I dehumanize people? Fantasy, the role of fantasy. Can we humanize ourselves? Sex and sexuality is so fundamental to being human, and yet nobody's talking to people like that. I learned about it through Playboy from a bad girl in school. I mean, that's how I learned. And I come from an educated, well-off family. So in India, right? So I think the point being is that given that most context, culture is so sticky, that porn has become a pathway to the internet, and the facts are there. Pornhub actually has realized this so much. They've got an educational channel. Pornhub is like, oh my God, we are the educators of sex, because there is no sex programs in any of these things. So there's an educational program. So we can go into each of the points that you brought up, but the point is that it's all, like I said, let's think about context and why it's always in relation to. We have to understand, it's not about relativistic. It's about in relation to, which allows you to understand why do people, despite the risks, do what they do. And also understand that if you were in their context, you would probably do what they are doing. So you could build some empathy so we can start to work as a global team towards, as you bring up, some serious crises which will impact all of us, like the planet, climate crisis, the data centers. We need to think jointly, because the ones who are, of course, most impacted are the global south, because these data centers are set up there in most of, and yet they are optimistic. And why? We need to understand why, right? What is it that they gain value, and not just write it off as being naive? Don't they understand? That's really what I'm trying to say.
Right.
Yeah, I'm Radhika Gurur from Deakin University. Thanks, Payal. Very provocative. I was thinking of a couple of things. So one is, this thing of, technology, like what's happening now, AI, etc., is fundamentally a very different thing to all other technologies that have gone before, or we thought we had the same sense of horror with every technology that came along. I was just wondering, how do we recognize when something actually different comes along? Because this kind of, it seems to be like an empirical matter, and a lot of I'll come to that in a minute. So that's one question. Or it's not a question of is it different or not, it's more a question of how can we tell, when it actually happens, when something comes along. So how do we know that the people that are crying wolf are, crying wolf in that sense, like that it's not a real thing, right? The second thing is that the talk of, both Tabitha and Gavin have mentioned, the idea of the binary, right? And in a way, I think this pessimism promise kind of is also set up as a binary, in response perhaps to one end of the pendulum. And this idea of somehow the middle ground, it seems to me like that whole thing of the third way, all of that. I think that's just a different epistemology that probably doesn't, probably never has worked, and probably is not. Like when people say you need to find a balance, I'm not sure that a balanced thing is what is required or good or healthy or whatever. So that's another thing. I think fundamentally the issue I have is something like what Tabitha was saying, actually, which is that in a way, by setting up all of the negative, the people that are kind of raising issues about the issues with tech, if we don't understand, if we don't take into account the things that they're raising, which are also not untrue, how will we actually do the things that you're saying, which is, make sure that we don't fall into those traps. So try to avoid those, or try to create tech which actually does better things, and so on. So in a way, I feel that if we didn't condemn those as, overly pessimistic, etc., but actually saw the value of the critique, because without that, you could not actually, do the other thing, right? If we only had the promise, how would we actually encounter all of those other things? And I actually absolutely agree with you that it is, in a way, it's a tech-enabled thing as well, that, like in YouTube and so on, unless you create outrageous or extreme content, you don't actually become an influencer, you don't get the likes and you don't get the hits and so on. So in a way, it's the same thing, right? The book titles have to be outrageous, so you have to be overly kind of alarmist. It's the same phenomenon, really. If you, as you pointed out as well, saying that this is a paradox that they were the same thing. So I do understand that, and I have also been one of those people that have said, look, if you're going to keep on saying negative things about things like evidence or data or anything else, then how do you ever actually, what are you offering instead, right? So I do understand about changing our language to be able to work with industry and to be able to work with policy, because I do agree that the way we talk now, we are not going to be welcomed, by tech or by industry or by policymakers, because we're not offering anything, any ways to make things better. And I think it's very encouraging that you're invited by Adobe or anybody else to actually say, well, what are the issues, and how, even if they're starting with how can we tap into this market, but if you're going to be able to say how can we tap into this market to their benefit, then I think that's fantastic. So in a way, basically, I'm saying these can be allies. They don't have to be, the enemy of tech. And I think without that, it will be a dangerous place.
Yeah, so thank you. That's a lot of rich points, and I may have to ask you to remind me of the first points, but let me just start responding, and then because I may have lost track, I want to respond to the beginning, and then I've forgotten because I'm growing old. But look,
how do we know when?
Oh yes, thank you. All right, no. So one is that I think it's important to understand that any new technology, we are first instincts is, oh my God, this is going to upend everything we hold dear. And then we get comforted because actually people are creatures of habit. Just because they build it doesn't mean people come. In fact, remember, like there's all sorts of technology, Second Life, people like, oh my God, people are going to have an entire life. What is actually very reassuring is that we are fundamentally social beings. Whether it was television, radio, etc., we use it intrinsically for communicative and social purposes because it's so important for us, because we don't want to be lonely. We want to have intimacy. We want to have, touch. We want to meet people in the end of the real life. We want to feel humanized, right? So I think that's something that has pervaded across technologies. And there's something very reassuring about that. Also, we shouldn't be scared about the diversity of manifestations. So what I think we should capture is not whether or not this is going to disrupt, but in what ways it is changing the ways in which we behave, our social life, the way in which we love, the way in which we make friends, the way in which we work and play, etc. And it is different for different contexts. Again, it's like, for example, Saudi Arabia and a lot of Middle East countries where they were using mobile technologies to extend existing practices, like, it could actually be more efficient in showing them which direction to pray, for example. And, there was all this discourse that mobile technologies are going to make them much more modern, So there's, the whole cosmopolitanism argument saying, well, actually, it didn't quite land up being one singular outcome of the way in which these technologies are going to be used, and it doesn't become a mirror of the West. In fact, there are multiplicity of outcomes based on the way in which we value in terms of different cultures and contexts. Some in negative ways, right, where it entrenches social norms, like women cannot show their profile photo in many countries because they're loose, or if they show a half sleeve shirt or whatnot, then they're a loose character. So I think another thing to remind ourselves is that as cultures, we are very, very sticky. We move glacially. If sometimes we even move backward, as I was saying, right? And so that in connection with technology, culture does win because we adapt technologies to extend a lot of our practices. But the question then is, in what ways are these extended? In what ways does it maybe shift the ways in which we can do better? So, for example, the Indian railway system, a lot of corruption was taking place and we circumvented, right?
So I don't have a problem at all saying that technology can do lots of good. In fact, no, I'm not contesting that at all. I'm just, I think, asking a very different question about more like an epistemological question, or even a practical, empirical question to say, and I think that's my point, is that these are all empirical matters, whether it actually does good or bad, or or both, or whatever, is an empirical matter, right? So we can't tell beforehand, or no way to tell. I think is fundamentally different. So basically, I'm saying that every time historically, it has been true that technologies we have domesticated them and kind of use them in multiple ways, and it has done good and bad, all of that, and maybe not really fundamentally shifted things as was feared in each
On the other hand, it could also example, but you're right, there will be points of tensions where we notice that it's not an extension, but it has pushed us to create new social practices to incorporate. When we feel, that means we have put value to that intervention from that technology that we feel is worth creating a new social practice to perpetuate and reproduce, right? But I want to answer quickly. I feel like we're almost to the tail end. Is the other end is because I have grappled with that too. Is that how do we go from being relativistic? Because we, of course, we should understand all this critique. But my issue with a lot of these books is that it is very much coming from the context and the starting positions of the Western, which is a Western context, which is wealthy nations which have liberal democracies and are generally educated. And so when you are, the whole weird acronym, right? And when you're starting from that position, that is very much true. But then and it is perfectly fine to be much more critical based on these contexts, because say Europeans see themselves as, well, what about in the last decade? It was much more peaceful. For example, we have much more threats from China with the auto industry, etc. But the universalizing of the context, not the feeling, but the context, means that we start from where the Americans or Europeans are at. And by the time we get to our context, we've lost steam because policies have been made, technologies have been designed, versus the other end. And this is why they are optimistic. Why are they optimistic? Because they don't want to have another lost generation. So, for example, they're like, okay, this technology may just help us leapfrog and create efficiencies, right? With maybe water resource management. Can we use AI to our benefit? Can we use it? In fact, one of the biggest excitement coming from the global south is how that finally we can create social linguistic diversity through data. That means these apps that talk about digital inclusion in a phenomenal way. It was extraordinarily unfeasible. It was too expensive. And now AI has already opened a pathway where many countries in Africa are able to capitalize on this by building multiple textbooks, etc., which has become much more affordable and scalable. So they're starting from a different logic and different vantage point. And they are not trying to universalize. They're not universalizing to the rest of the world, right? And so there's a sort of a Western arrogance that surely their concerns are ours and our problems are ours. And we need to start at multiple points. And last, I think somebody else brought up about the labor, like people like, yeah, but isn't it extractive? Like, look at these annotators and content moderators and all, and how the future of work, how they're being exploited. They're not even beneficiaries. In fact, I literally at the University of Cambridge, a number of now academics, there's a legitimate group now, growing group called anarchists, which believe that we should disrupt all systems. And this has become a thing now in academia. It's extremely unproductive because basically you don't have to stand for anything but the destruction of everything, right? If you think about it. Also, this whole hype on neo-Marxism. I mean, if we go by the empirical logic, why do academics love something which has failed so miserably and caused so much violence and pain in most of history when it's been operationalized? It goes to show how much we love the idea without the empirical notion, right? So neo-Marxist approaches to technology, including that of AI, thereby saying, oh, then you're being enslaved. But on the contrary, if we look at the protests happening, even with content moderators in the Philippines and Vietnam, or the annotators in Nigeria, in Namibia, in India, what we're hearing is that they are going on strikes not to get rid of these technologies, mind you, because in relation to their previous jobs, this does pay better. This does afford more flexibility. This does afford, because they were doing like bead making. Women in annotators in India, in rural areas, were doing bead making. And it was really bad for their eyes and their hands. And we've been working with artisanal communities for years. And so for them, they are just demanding fairer work conditions, better support, fairer pay, but listen to each of them. And they're not talking about getting rid of the jobs. They just want to improve their work. And what are we saying? We need to stop them from being exploited. So we need to kill that industry. There are two different conversations happening because we believe this is exploitative and they're asking for just, well, what we would ask for is fair work, And I think this is where the discrepancies lie. So, yeah, but we can talk more, and I'm sure there was also the in between, which I've also forgot. But we will have more conversations. So
Sure. If there's no burning questions, we might end it there. Thank you everyone very much online. Thank you everyone very much here for the very robust discussion about the really provocative points. And I'll end it by saying I actually love that pessimism to promise because there's no S on the end of promise. It's not the promises of tech, but there might be some promise in them. At least that's what I've taken from your talk. So I appreciate that point very much. And yeah, one more round of applause for Payal.
I missed some little point.